Hey everybody, welcome back to Kirkham A Movie A Day. I'm Richard Kirkham, coming to you directly from the Cliff Booth catalog of apparel. Let me tell you, I have a lot of ideas about the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, some of which I wrote about in my previous post, but I wanted to go into a little bit more detail on some of these things because, people have been talking about it. There's been some online discussion and criticism, and I want to get into those issues in a little bit more detail. Let's start with the criticisms, and then I've got some more praise for the film. On the criticisms, the biggest one, the one that I come the closest to agreeing with, is that the movie is too long. It's 2 hours and 40 minutes. It could easily be trimmed by 20 minutes and still be pretty effective. There are some long segments where nothing happens. We're watching minor details occur that aren't part of the story. But there are a lot of side tracks that you go into that make the story interesting, and I would hate to cut a lot of those things out. Most of them are worth having. They are entertaining. The problem is that the story meanders. It's really just a series of vignettes that comes together at the conclusion, but not necessarily everything is important to the main track of the story. Some things are set up early on, and then there's a payoff for them, and I can see why it's necessary, but it sure feels like you are traveling a long distance to get to that payoff. We'll talk about the payoff in just a few minutes. Another criticism of the film is that it is in some way anti-feminist, that there's something about the movie that undermines the way that Tarantino sees women. Well, the main women depicted in the film are members of the Manson cult. The other two people that are depicted in the film that are women, of any prominence at least, are Rick's wife, who is very heroic at the end of the movie, and Sharon Tate, who is kind of the background muse for everything that's going on. And there's a criticism about her role, and I'll get to that in just a second. But the idea that this is anti-feminist because the brutal murderers that are depicted in the film are given the comeuppance that most of us would have preferred to have them have instead of what ultimately resulted is ridiculous. The truth of the matter is that the women portrayed in this movie were in fact vicious killers, and even though there was something charming about them at times, there were also things about them that were horrible. And this is 1969. Every time one of those characters mentions the idea that they're a bunch of dirty hippies living someplace, well, guess what? That's, unfortunately, for history's sake, exactly what was going on. You had a bunch of people living in a communal area that was nothing more than a cult. It was basically a sex and drug cult, and their hygiene was not all that great. So we've got vicious women living in squalor, dominated by a horrifying man, which, by the way, were all accurate descriptions of what was going on. This is not an invention of Tarantino. This is the way things were there. So the notion that this is somehow anti-feminist, just as I don't understand how people come up with that interpretation. The only other thing that I can think of is that the Sharon Tate role is smaller and it seems less important than the role of the other two leads. Margot Robbie, I think, does a great job portraying what Tarantino wants us to see about Sharon Tate. She is an ethereal figure, one of hope and promise. She has some talent, but more than talent, she has a life, a personality. She has characteristics that all of us can identify with. Whether or not she would have ever been a great actress is not the point. The fact of the matter is that she had things to live for. There was something about her that was effervescent that people were attracted to, and it was snuffed out in the real world by a group of horrible human beings. And this is an attempt to tell us a fairy tale. If you aren't aware of it, Once Upon a Time is the start of all kinds of fairy tales, and often they're trying to fix a solution. Now, I know the Grimm fairy tales often ended up in something that's pretty awful, but most of the kids in the world, when they hear Once Upon a Time, they're looking forward to something that's going to be positive in the outcome. And that's what Tarantino has done. He's revised the story to make it something more positive. This is not a story about the Sharon Tate murders. This is a story about Hollywood in 1969, the kind of culture that was going on in Southern California, and how destructive that culture could be at times, and then reimagining it in some way. Sharon Tate simply represents the promise of the future being destroyed by what was going on in the present. And I thought that Margot Robbie conveyed that very efficiently. She didn't need a lot of lines. The facial expressions when she's watching the movie in Westwood are priceless. Her sweet demeanor when she's picking up the gift for her husband is wonderful. And at the end, we'll talk about this a little bit, her hopefulness and her friendliness toward a neighbor are things that all of us should strive for. So I don't understand when people say that her role was diminished in some way. She is a side character in this story, an important side character, but she didn't need a lot of lines to accomplish what's supposed to be presented here. And people who are criticizing it for that reason, that doesn't make any sense to me. Now let me give you some praise for some of the things that happen in the movie. Let's begin with the Hollywood details. Tarantino was very careful to try and recreate Southern California in 1969. So you get a lot of things that are representative of that. Probably the best example of that is when Cliff and Rick are cruising through Hollywood Boulevard, both at night and during the daytime, and you see background flashes of old Hollywood Boulevard there. You can see the Pussycat Theater, you can see the Supply Sergeant, you can see the Vogue Theater. They cruise by the Cinerama Dome at one point, and they're pretty accurate in the way that it looked. I was there, I remember what all of that stuff looked like, and I think I would have enjoyed seeing even more of Hollywood Boulevard at that time, but let's face it, those things are on the screen for just a few seconds at a time. The costumes are amazingly accurate. Look, I've already mentioned how Cliff Booth is decked out in a Champion t-shirt and Hawaiian shirt, and you know what? That's the kind of slacker look from 1969. The costuming that they do for Rick Dalton in the pilot that he's working on, where he's going to be the villain in the pilot, I think is a pretty accurate representation. There's a discussion by the costumers of what it is they're trying to make him look like, and I thought that worked really well. The guy who plays Steve McQueen at the Playboy party, he was fantastic. He comes across exactly like McQueen. He looks a little bit like McQueen, and his attitude reflects it all as you're going on there. And the hitchhiking in Hollywood at the time with the hippies on the street, that's another thing that's really accurate. There are just a lot of different things that are great details. When Sharon Tate, not Sharon Stone, when Sharon Tate ends up with her friends the night before all this horrible stuff is supposed to have happened at El Coyote, I was thrilled to pieces. El Coyote is one of my old stomping grounds. I used to eat at El Coyote twice a week when I was in college. It was a hangout for the Trojan Debate Squad. We always got the number 2, and apparently the margaritas were a pretty good discount. I didn't drink, so it wasn't something that I worried that much about. I sat in that booth that they sit in the movie. I've been in that booth a dozen times in my life. Of course, a dozen other booths at El Coyote as well. And the restaurant, they didn't have to do much to change it because it looks pretty much exactly the same it did 40 years ago, 50 years ago. It's 50 years ago now. Holy criminy, time passes. All right, now there's some key moments in the movie that I think do live up to the Tarantino standards. One of my main criticisms of the film was that the dialogue is not as snappy and as interesting as it is in some of his other films. You know, Django, Inglourious Bastards have passages in them that you could just sit and listen to for a long period of time and enjoy the performance of the actors just by listening to that dialogue. You don't get quite the same thing here, but there are two key moments in the film that I thought almost live up to that. The first is when Rick Dalton is engaged with the conversation with Abigail / Maribel, or actress Julia Butters as we know her, the young woman who portrays the kid actor that Dalton has a conversation with both before shooting and after they shoot their scene together. They're terrific. She is fantastic. She talks to him like the wisest person that we've seen in the movie, and somebody that you could really rely on and trust. And he recognizes his own limitations and thinks, I mean, we don't hear him saying it out loud, but we pretty much get the idea. This child is doing stuff that I ought to be doing, and he's got to work harder in order to succeed. And when she gives him that compliment after their scene, it's a moment of redemption that really is worthwhile. So I think that that's a key moment. The other key moment in the film that before the climax is when Cliff visits the Spahn Ranch. That old movie ranch was a real place. I think it's depicted very accurately. Bruce Dern apparently stepped into the part that was originally going to be played by Burt Reynolds, playing, I think it's George Spahn, the owner of the ranch. And, you know, I was never there myself, but I know people who were there. And the Dante Ranch, which was a ranch owned by the magician Dante here in Southern California, is not too far from there. So I know that my father was up there all the time. There's a great story that I heard on the Mark and Brian radio show many years ago. The news guy there, Chuck Moshans, talked about hitching a ride with some characters coming back from Northern California and dropping them off at the ranch. And it turns out it was Tex Watson and a couple of the other people from the place. And they were encouraged to come back, but if they were going to come back, they needed to plan on staying. And Chuck, that was his close encounter with Charles Manson, and you get that whole vibe when you were there in this movie. There's something creepy about all the people. They don't say much. They're all staring at Cliff as he's walking up to the main house. Squeaky Fromm is belligerent, and Dakota Fanning, I didn't even recognize her at first. I thought she was terrific in the movie as well. I think Bruce Dern might very well have been a better choice than Burt Reynolds, although I think Burt Reynolds would have been fantastic too. But that whole sequence where Cliff ultimately smashes the face of one of the cultists, takes charge of the situation, and raises all kinds of alarms in our head. It's creepy, it's funny, it's suspenseful, and it has a little bit of a payoff to it. And that's a good scene from the Tarantino film. Alright, let's get to the violent resolution. This is the thing that most people wanting a Tarantino film are going to be looking forward to. There are outbursts of violence. It's not violent all the way through, but there are outbursts of violence. And the climax of the film is one of the most violent things you're going to see. It is, and unfortunately, it's really satisfying because he's turned the tables on the cult. He is in essence given the audience the chance to have the fairy tale ending that would have made us so much happier rather than the miserable Grimm's fairy tale ending that we actually got. And to me, that means that it's a revisionist story, but it's one that's worth listening to and watching. And the coda at the end, where Rick is invited up by Jay Sebring, the former fiance of Sharon Tate, and they all meet up there and they start talking and having a drink together. And it's the thought that if only that was the outcome that had happened, think how much better the world would have been. Think how differently we would have seen time. It's a chance to have a warm piece of imagination after the violent piece of imagery that we had before. Sure, it's a fairy tale, but it's an entertaining fairy tale. So that's my take on it. I think many people want to continue to talk about this film. I don't think it's Tarantino's greatest film. I think it falls kind of in the middle of his catalog of films. But I'll tell you what, it's entertaining, and the conclusion, I think, makes the previous couple of hours worthwhile. Till next time, I'll see you. This is Richard Kirkham at Kirkham A Movie A Day. Have a good one.